It was a cold February evening in Richmond, Virginia, when Albert Hayes walked out of the state penitentiary after serving 20 years behind bars. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled of damp earth from the earlier rain. He had waited for this moment, but not with the eagerness of a man yearning for freedom. No, Albert had only one thing on his mind: justice. His justice. Dressed in a faded brown jacket and jeans that no longer fit right, Albert stood still for a moment, breathing in the outside air. The world had changed. Cars looked different, people moved faster, and technology had taken over everything. He felt like a relic from the past, an old ghost stepping into a future that had no place for him. A white sedan pulled up near the prison gates. A short, stocky man with a thick mustache stepped out, his face breaking into a grin. "Al, you son of a gun, I can't believe it." The man's voice was filled with excitement. Albert smirked. "Didn't think I'd make it out, did you, Roy?" Roy Mason, his old cellmate and the only friend he had left in the world, clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on, let's get you something to eat. I know a place." Albert didn't argue. He slid into the passenger seat, his mind already miles away. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't tired. He wasn't even happy to be free. The only thing that kept his heart beating was the thought of what his wife, Gloria, had done while he was locked up. 20 years ago, Albert Hayes had been a respected man in Richmond. He owned 3 gas stations, a car repair shop, and a 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood. His wife, Gloria, had been his queen, beautiful, charming, and always the center of attention. They had been married for 10 years with no children, but they were inseparable, or so he had thought. Then everything had come crashing down. One night, a deal went bad. A group of criminals had approached him about using his repair shop to launder money. Albert refused. The next day, someone tipped off the cops that he was running an illegal operation. It didn't matter that he was innocent. Evidence was planted, witnesses lied, and before he knew it, he was sentenced to life in prison for crimes he never committed. For the first 5 years, he wrote letters to Gloria. At first, she replied, promising to fight for him, swearing her love. But over time, the letters stopped. His calls went unanswered. One day, a fellow inmate told him that Gloria had sold everything he owned and remarried. That was the day Albert stopped believing in second chances. Present day. Albert sat in Roy's car, staring out the window. "Find her?" he asked, his voice rough from years of silence. Roy nodded, lighting a cigarette. "Oh yeah, she's still in Richmond, married to some guy named Martin Willis. Lives in a nice house out in Chesterfield. She sold everything, Al. The gas stations, the house. Every last dime of yours, gone." Albert clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "Does she know I'm out?" "Number. But she will soon." Roy handed him a manila envelope filled with pictures. Gloria, still beautiful but older. Gloria, smiling beside her new husband. Gloria, living the life Albert had built. "She took everything from me," Albert murmured. Roy exhaled a long breath. "So, what's the plan?" Albert turned to him, his eyes dark with cold determination. "I'm going to make sure she never forgets what she did." Roy grinned. "That's what I thought." Albert didn't smile. He just looked out at the city that had betrayed him, his mind already painting a picture of the night Gloria Willis would die. Gloria Willis adjusted her pearl earrings in the mirror and smiled. At 48, she still had the beauty that had once turned heads. Her brown hair, now styled in soft waves, had only a few streaks of gray. Life had been good to her. A warm home, a caring husband, and a past buried deep where it couldn't haunt her. Or so she thought. Downstairs, her husband, Martin Willis, was sipping whiskey in the living room, flipping through the channels absent-mindedly. He was a kind man, much older than Gloria, a retired accountant who had given her the stability she never had with Albert. Albert. The name sent a chill through her. It had been 20 years. She rarely thought about him anymore. The first few years were hard, the guilt pressing down on her chest every night. But after she sold the house, the businesses, and moved on, the past became just that, the past. She hadn't loved Albert when he went to prison. Not really. He had been a means to an end, a man with money and a future. But when that future crumbled, she saw no reason to hold on. Martin had come along when she needed him, and that was all that mattered. A sudden creak on the porch made her pause. She turned toward the window, heart pounding slightly. The wind, she told herself. Just the wind. Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Albert stood across the street from Gloria's house, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. His breath came out in slow, controlled puffs in the chilly night air. The house was bigger than he expected, nicer than anything they had before. She had done well for herself, on his dime. He watched her silhouette move past the upstairs window. Same walk, same posture. It was strange seeing her after so many years. His stomach tightened. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. She had betrayed him in the worst way. From his spot, he could see Martin Willis through the large glass window in the living room, sipping his drink, completely unaware that death was standing outside. Albert turned away and walked back toward Roy's car. He wasn't going to do anything tonight. Not yet. He had waited 20 years. He could wait a little longer. Detective Charles Bennett hated mornings, especially the cold ones. His office at the Richmond Police Department was cluttered with case files, a half-eaten bagel, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. A seasoned investigator in his mid-50s, Bennett had seen it all: murders, robberies, missing persons. But there was something about old cases that always fascinated him. The ghosts of the past had a way of catching up with the present, and when they did, they usually left a mess behind. That morning, a file landed on his desk. It was a simple notification: Albert Hayes had been released from prison. Bennett remembered the case. A well-off businessman convicted of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He had always found the whole thing suspicious. Too clean, too convenient. But at the time, there had been no reason to doubt the evidence. Now something told him that Albert wasn't just going to fade away. Pulling up a fresh document, he typed a few notes to himself. Follow up on Hayes' release. Locate Gloria Willis. Possible retaliation? Bennett didn't believe in coincidences, and something about this felt all too predictable. Later that evening, Gloria was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard it. 3 slow knocks at the front door. Not the usual sharp raps of a visitor, but a deliberate, measured knock that sent an uncomfortable chill down her spine. Martin was in his study, so she wiped her hands on a towel and made her way to the door. Peeking through the peephole, she saw no one. Her heart thudded. "Hello," she called, her voice uncertain. No answer. She hesitated, then unlocked the door and cracked it open just enough to see outside. Nothing but the empty street. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the driveway. Gloria swallowed hard and shut the door, locking it this time. As she turned away, she spotted something on the doormat. A single black glove. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands trembled as she bent down to pick it up. It was old, worn out, but there was something familiar about it. Then it hit her. It was Albert's. A wave of panic surged through her. She stumbled back, clutching the glove, her mind racing. He was out, and he was watching her. Detective Bennett sat in his car, parked a few houses down from Gloria Willis's residence. He had called ahead, pretending to be following up on an old fraud case, but in truth, he was here for one reason: Albert Hayes. When Gloria opened the door, she looked pale, shaken. Something had already happened. He could see it in her face. "Mrs. Willis?" he said, flashing his badge. "Yes?" she answered, her voice unsteady. "I'm Detective Charles Bennett. I need to ask you a few questions about Albert Hayes." The color drained from her face. "Why?" "Because I think he might be coming for you." Gloria let out a shaky breath and stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. Inside, she handed him the black glove. "I found this on my porch." Bennett turned it over in his hands. "You're sure it's his?" Gloria nodded. "Yes, and I think he's watching me." Bennett sighed. He had been right. Albert Hayes wasn't a man to let go of the past, and if he was already sending messages, then it was only a matter of time before things turned deadly. Gloria barely slept that night. Every creak in the house, every distant sound outside made her heart race. She kept the black glove on the nightstand beside her, as if its presence could somehow keep her alert. Martin, of course, was less concerned. "You're overreacting," he said, climbing into bed. "The man just got out of prison. Do you really think he'd be dumb enough to come after you?" Gloria turned to him. her voice a sharp whisper. He's already here, Martin. That glove wasn't just some accident. Martin sighed, rubbing his temples. Then let the police handle it. Gloria wanted to believe that was enough. But deep down, she knew Albert better than Martin did. He wasn't a man to forgive or forget, and now that he was free, she doubted anything would stop him from getting what he thought he deserved. Detective Bennett sat in his office the next morning, reviewing Albert Hayes' file again. Something about the case had never felt right to him. Too many things had lined up too neatly for Albert's conviction. But now, with Hayes back on the streets, the real story was starting to unfold. He picked up the phone and dialed the warden's office at Richmond State Penitentiary. Bennett here. I need information on Albert Hayes, his behavior, visitors, any connections he made inside. The warden chuckled. Hayes kept to himself mostly, never caused trouble. Had one steady visitor, though, a guy named Roy Mason. Did his time and got out a few years back. Bennett scribbled the name down. Mason? What do we know about him? Petty thief, mostly. Small-time con artist. Nothing major. But he and Hayes were close. Bennett leaned back in his chair. If Hayes had a friend waiting for him, that meant he wasn't planning to just quietly reintegrate into society. He hung up and made another call, this time to one of his informants on the streets. I need a location on Roy Mason, yesterday. Something told him that if he found Roy, he'd get a step closer to finding Albert and stopping him before it was too late. Gloria tried to go about her day as if things were normal, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When she went to the grocery store, she felt eyes on her back. When she pulled into the driveway, she hesitated before getting out of the car, scanning the yard for any movement. By the time the sun set, she was exhausted. I'm telling you, Gloria, you're stressing over nothing, Martin said as they sat down for dinner. She pushed her plate away, her appetite gone. You didn't know Albert the way I did. He wasn't the type to let go of things. Martin rolled his eyes and took another sip of whiskey. Then the power went out. The house was swallowed in darkness. Gloria froze. Did you pay the bill? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Martin scoffed. Of course I paid the... A sudden crash outside cut him off. The sound of shattering glass. Gloria shot to her feet. Martin! He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped toward the back door. Stay here. No, don't. Too late. Martin opened the door just as a shadow moved across the yard. The flashlight flickered on, illuminating the backyard just in time for Martin to see something metallic glint in the dark. Then came the sound of a gunshot. Gloria screamed. Martin staggered backward, clutching his chest as blood blossomed through his shirt. He crumpled onto the kitchen floor, gasping for air. Gloria dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against the wound. Martin! Oh my God, Martin! The back door creaked open wider. Heavy boots stepped onto the kitchen tile. Gloria's breath hitched as she looked up. Albert Hayes stood before her, his face shadowed by the dim light from the street lamp outside. It's been a long time, Gloria, he said, his voice as cold as the night air. Gloria's hands trembled as she pressed down harder on Martin's wound. Albert, please. He tilted his head, as if amused. You took everything from me. She shook her head, tears spilling down her face. I didn't have a choice. Albert crouched beside her, his fingers tracing the barrel of the gun. Oh, you had a choice, all right, Martin gurgled, his breathing becoming shallower. Albert watched him for a moment, then smirked. Looks like your new husband doesn't have much time left. That's a shame. Gloria clutched Martin's hand, sobbing. Please, just let me call an ambulance. Albert leaned in closer, his lips barely an inch from her ear. Why should I? Before she could answer, the distant sound of sirens broke through the silence. Red and blue lights flashed outside the house. Albert's smirk faded. Looks like we'll have to finish this later. With that, he turned and slipped into the darkness, vanishing just before the police arrived. Gloria collapsed over Martin, sobbing uncontrollably as the officers rushed in. Detective Bennett pushed through the crowd of officers at the scene, his gut twisting at the sight of the bloodied kitchen floor. Paramedics were working on Martin, but the shaking of their heads told him it wasn't looking good. Gloria was wrapped in a blanket, her eyes empty, her hands still stained with blood. Bennett knelt beside her. Mrs. Willis, what happened? Her voice was barely a whisper. He was here. Who? Albert. Bennett exhaled sharply. It was worse than he thought. Albert Hayes wasn't just planning revenge. He had already started. Detective Charles Bennett stood over the crime scene, the weight of the case pressing down on his shoulders like a ton of bricks. The kitchen was a mess. Blood smeared across the tiled floor, an overturned chair, shattered glass from where a bullet had struck the cabinet. Martin Willis had been pronounced dead minutes ago. Gloria sat on the couch, wrapped in a police-issued blanket, her eyes empty, her fingers still trembling. She had stopped crying, but Bennett knew that was the kind of shock that didn't fade easily. He knelt beside her. "Gloria, I need you to tell me everything." She blinked as if seeing him for the first time. "He was here," she whispered. "Albert was here." Bennett sighed. "I know, but I need details. What exactly did he say? What did he do?" Gloria swallowed hard. "He said I took everything from him. He wanted me to pay." Her voice broke on the last word. "He shot Martin. He was going to kill me. But then the police came." Bennett scribbled notes in his pad. This was no ordinary revenge. This was personal, premeditated. Albert wasn't just lashing out in a moment of rage. He had planned this, and that meant he wasn't finished. Bennett drove back to the station, his mind racing. Albert had disappeared before the cops arrived. That meant he had an escape plan, and escape plans required help. Roy Mason. Bennett pulled into the precinct parking lot and headed straight for the records department. Within minutes, he had Roy Mason's last known address, a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. He grabbed his car keys and called his partner, Detective Lisa Carter. "Lisa, meet me at the Evergreen Motel. I think I know where Albert Hayes has been hiding." The neon vacancy sign flickered as Bennett pulled into the motel lot. It was the kind of place where people disappeared, either into drugs, crime, or something worse. Lisa Carter was already waiting outside. A sharp, no-nonsense detective, she had been Bennett's partner for 6 years. She met him with a nod. "You think Mason's here?" she asked. "I think if Albert's still in town, this guy knows where," Bennett replied. They approached the front desk, where a tired-looking clerk barely glanced up. "Room 12, the clerk muttered when they flashed their badges. "He's been here a while." Bennett and Carter moved quickly. Guns drawn, they reached room 12. Bennett pounded on the door. "Roy Mason, Richmond PD, open up!" Silence. Then, a scuffle inside. "Damn it," Bennett muttered. "He's running." He kicked the door open. Roy Mason was halfway out the bathroom window when Carter grabbed his leg and yanked him back inside. He hit the floor with a grunt, scrambling to his feet. All right, don't shoot," he gasped. Bennett pressed him against the wall. "Where is Albert Hayes?" Mason smirked. "Haven't seen him." Bennett pulled out his phone and showed Mason the crime scene photo of Martin Willis. "Blood everywhere." "You sure about that?" Bennett asked. Mason's smirk faded. He licked his lips, nervous now. "Look, man, Albert's angry, real angry. He says she ruined his life. He just wanted to scare her, I swear." Bennett leaned in. "He didn't just scare her, Mason. He killed a man." Mason swallowed hard. "I told him not to do anything stupid. He was supposed to lay low, wait for things to settle, but he ain't listening." Carter crossed her arms. "Where is he?" Mason hesitated. "He said he needed to go somewhere, a place that meant something to him." Bennett frowned. "Be specific." Mason sighed. "The old house, the one he used to own." Bennett's stomach dropped. He knew exactly where Albert was going. Bennett and Carter sped through the city, sirens wailing. The old Hayes residence was on the outskirts of town, abandoned for years. If Albert was there, it meant he was ready to end this, one way or another. By the time they arrived, the house was dark, its windows broken, the front yard overgrown. Bennett motioned for Carter to go around back as he approached the front door, gun drawn. He nudged it open. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Dust covered the floors, but fresh footprints led deeper inside. Bennett followed them to what had once been the master bedroom. Albert was there. He stood by the window, staring out into the night. He didn't turn when Bennett entered. "You found me," Albert said quietly. "Put your hands where I can see them," Bennett ordered. Albert exhaled. I built this place, you know, every part of it, and she sold it like it was nothing. She moved on, Bennett said. And so should you. Albert laughed bitterly. 20 years. That's how long I sat in that cell. 20 years, knowing she took everything from me. And now, Martin Willis is dead, and she's finally feeling what I felt. She's feeling more than that, Bennett replied. She's terrified. You could have walked away, Albert, but you didn't. Albert turned to face him, eyes cold and empty. And what now? You're going to take me back? Lock me up again? Bennett tightened his grip on his gun. That's exactly what's going to happen. Albert smirked. Not if I have a say in it. In one swift motion, he reached into his jacket. Bennett fired. The shot echoed through the empty house. Albert staggered, clutching his chest as he sank to his knees. Carter burst through the back door, gun raised. Bennett? Bennett lowered his weapon, staring down at Albert. The man let out a weak chuckle, blood seeping through his fingers. Guess. I lost everything after all. His body slumped forward. Bennett sighed, holstering his weapon. It was over. Carter looked at him. You okay? Bennett exhaled. Yeah, just tired. The case was closed, but the damage had already been done. Gloria would never be the same, and neither would he. The morning after Albert Hayes took his last breath, the sun rose over Richmond with an eerie sense of stillness. The city had moved on as if nothing had happened, but for Gloria Willis, nothing would ever be the same again. She sat in the police station, staring blankly at the cup of coffee Detective Bennett had placed in front of her. It had gone cold an hour ago, untouched. Her hands still bore faint traces of Martin's blood, even though she had washed them a dozen times. Bennett sat across from her, waiting for her to speak. She hadn't said much since they brought her in. Gloria, he said gently, Albert Hayes is dead. You're safe now. She flinched at the name. Safe, she whispered. Martin is dead. My whole life is ruined. Safe doesn't mean anything anymore. Bennett sighed. He'd seen this before. The way grief wrapped itself around people like a second skin, making it hard to breathe. We need your official statement, he said. Once that's done, we can help you move forward. She let out a hollow laugh. Move forward to what? Bennett didn't have an answer for that. While Bennett handled Gloria, Lisa Carter went through the final pieces of evidence. The case seemed closed. Albert Hayes had committed murder and paid the ultimate price. But something still felt off. She flipped through old police reports from Albert's original case, the one that put him away 20 years ago. There was something unsettling about it. The testimony that got him convicted had come from Gloria. Gloria had told the court that Albert had beaten her, that she had feared for her life every day of their marriage. That was why, when his business dealings went bad and he was arrested for fraud, she never fought for him. She had been eager to be free. Carter frowned. If that was true, why had Albert waited 20 years for revenge? Why hadn't he tried to hurt her back then? And why had he laughed at the end, as if he had won? She looked at the last thing Albert ever said. Guess I lost everything after all. That wasn't the statement of a man who had gotten revenge. That was the statement of a man who had figured out the truth. Too late. That evening, Bennett sat in his office, reviewing everything Carter had found. Gloria had told the world that Albert had been a violent man, but their records showed no history of domestic violence reports, no hospital visits, no restraining orders. Then there was the matter of Albert's properties. Gloria had sold everything before he even went to prison, before she knew for sure he wasn't coming back. And who had she married? Martin Willis, a real estate investor, a man who had made a fortune off those very properties. Bennett ran a hand down his face. Son of a... Gloria hadn't been a victim. She had been a thief. She and Martin had worked together to take everything from Albert, ensuring he rotted in prison with nothing to come back to. And when Albert returned, he had walked right into their trap. Martin had been the bait. Albert had killed him, and now Gloria was free. Bennett drove back to Gloria's house, his gut churning. She answered the door, looking exhausted, dressed in black as if she were already mourning. Detective, she said, feigning surprise. Is something wrong? Bennett stared at her, his jaw tight. You tell me. Gloria frowned. I already gave my statement. I don't believe a word of it. She went still. Excuse me, you weren't Albert's victim, Bennett said coldly. You were his executioner. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Albert wasn't an innocent man, but he didn't deserve what you did to him, Bennett continued. You made sure he had nothing to come back to. You and Martin took it all. And when he came looking for justice, you made sure the only way he left was in a body bag. Gloria's expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Bennett took a step closer. I think you do. I think you played this game a long time ago, and you think you won. Gloria folded her arms. If you had any evidence, Detective, I'd be in handcuffs. Bennett studied her for a long moment, then he smiled. Not yet. Her eyes flickered with the slightest hint of fear. She knew. She knew the truth would come out eventually. Bennett tipped his hat. I'll be seeing you, Mrs. Willis. As he walked away, he heard the door close behind him. He didn't need to hear it to know Gloria was holding her breath. She had won the battle. But the war wasn't over. Detective Charles Bennett knew one thing for sure. Justice wasn't about what you knew. It was about what you could prove. He sat at his desk, the dim glow of his office lamp illuminating the case files spread before him. Gloria Willis had played her part well. Grieving widow, terrified victim. But something about her story still didn't sit right. He tapped his pen against the desk. He needed more. He needed to know how deep this betrayal ran. He needed to know if Gloria Willis had just been a greedy woman, or if she had been planning this for far longer than anyone had realized. Tell me you found something, Bennett said as Lisa Carter slid a thick folder onto his desk. You were right, Carter said, crossing her arms. Gloria didn't just sell Albert's properties after he was arrested. She did it before he was even sentenced. She had everything transferred to her name within 2 months of his arrest. That means she knew he wasn't getting out. Bennett frowned. That's not something a wife does if she still has hope. It gets worse, Carter said. Martin Willis wasn't just a real estate investor. He was one of the people who bought Albert's properties at way below market value. Bennett's jaw tightened. So it was a setup. Looks like it. Bennett exhaled sharply. That means we need to go back further. I want to know exactly what Martin and Gloria were doing before Albert went to prison. Carter nodded. Already ahead of you. I pulled their phone records from 20 years ago. She slid another folder across the desk. Guess who Gloria was calling while Albert was on trial? Bennett opened the folder. His stomach dropped. It was Martin Willis, months before Albert was even convicted. Bennett closed the folder. She's been playing this game for a long time, Carter nodded, and she's damn good at it. The next morning, Bennett and Carter drove to the Richmond District Attorney's office. If Gloria had set Albert up, then someone in the justice system had been part of it, even if unknowingly. They met with Claire Dunham, a former prosecutor who had handled Albert's case 2 decades ago. I barely remember this case, Claire admitted, flipping through the old files. Albert Hayes was a fraudster. The evidence was strong, financial records, testimonies from clients he scammed. Testimonies from who? Bennett cut in. Claire skimmed through the documents. A few people, but the key witness was Gloria Hayes. Bennett exchanged a glance with Carter. Claire frowned. Something wrong? Did anyone double-check her claims back then? Carter asked. Claire hesitated. She was his wife. Her testimony held weight. Bennett clenched his jaw. What if she lied? Claire looked startled. You think she framed him? I think she and Martin Willis orchestrated the whole thing, Bennett said. I think they wanted Albert out of the picture so they could take his properties and build a fortune. Claire looked at the files again, this time with suspicion. If that's true, then we put an innocent man away. Bennett shook his head. Albert wasn't innocent. He committed financial crimes, but he didn't deserve this. Claire exhaled. If you can get me proof that Gloria lied under oath, I can push for a review of the case. But after all these years, that won't be easy. Bennett stood. Nothing about this case has been easy. Back at the precinct, Carter worked through old case notes. One thing stood out. A name that had been barely mentioned in the trial. A former business partner of Albert's, Darius had testified briefly before disappearing off the radar. At the time, no one had questioned why. Carter tracked him down to a small town 2 hours away. They found him in a dingy auto repair shop, hunched over an old Ford with grease-stained hands. "You got the wrong guy," Darius said the moment he saw their badges. Bennett stepped forward. "We're here about Albert Hayes." Darius froze. Carter folded her arms. "You testified against him 20 years ago. Then you disappeared." Darius wiped his hands on a rag, eyes darting around like he was considering running. I had to," he said finally. "Things got complicated." Bennett narrowed his eyes. "Complicated how?" Darius hesitated. Then he sighed. "Gloria paid me to lie." Carter stiffened. "Say that again." Darius looked at them, guilt written all over his face. "Gloria and Martin approached me before Albert even got arrested. They knew he was in trouble. They offered me money to say whatever they needed in court." Bennett felt his blood run cold. Darius swallowed. "I didn't think it mattered. Albert was guilty of fraud anyway, right? But after he went away, I realized what I did. They didn't just want him locked up. They wanted everything he had." Bennett's hands clenched into fists. "And you let it happen." Darius exhaled. "I regret it every damn day." Carter crossed her arms. "You're going to regret it even more if you don't make it right." Darius looked down, his jaw tight. "What do you need from me?" Bennett stared at him. "Your confession, signed." Darius hesitated. Then he nodded. Later that evening, Bennett and Carter returned to Gloria's house. She opened the door with a tired expression. "Detectives, I thought this case was over." Bennett smirked. "It's just getting started." He pulled out a document and handed it to her. Gloria read it, her face slowly draining of color. What is this?" "A sworn affidavit from Darius Mitchell," Carter said coldly. "He just confessed that you and Martin Willis bribed him to lie in court." "You framed Albert." Gloria swallowed hard. Bennett leaned in. "We also have financial records showing you transferred all of Albert's assets to yourself before he was sentenced. And we have proof that you and Martin were involved before Albert ever went to prison." Gloria's hands trembled. You can't prove anything." Carter smirked. "We can prove enough." Bennett's eyes darkened. "You may have gotten away with it for 20 years, but this time, you're the one going to prison." The color drained from Gloria's face. For the first time, she realized she had lost, and there was nothing she could do about it. Gloria Willis sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the cold metal table. She had always been in control. She had always known how to manipulate a situation, how to twist a narrative to her advantage. But this time, there was no escape. Detective Charles Bennett and Lisa Carter sat across from her, their expressions unreadable. Between them lay the damning evidence. Darius Mitchell's signed confession, property transfer records, and phone records connecting her to Martin Willis before Albert was even convicted. For the first time in decades, Gloria felt powerless. Bennett leaned forward, his voice low and firm. "We know everything, Gloria. You and Martin orchestrated the entire thing. You framed Albert, stole his properties, and built a life together while he rotted in prison." Gloria's jaw clenched. "You have no proof," Carter smirked. "That's where you're wrong. We have enough to charge you with perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice." Gloria exhaled sharply. "You think this will hold up in court?" Bennett gave a slow nod. "With a witness willing to testify?" "Absolutely." For a moment, Gloria said nothing. Then she let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "You don't get it, do you?" She met Bennett's gaze. "Albert was a criminal. He stole from people. I just did what I had to do." Carter's expression hardened. "What you had to do? You destroyed a man's life for money," Gloria scoffed. "Albert wasn't innocent," Bennett nodded. "Maybe not, but that doesn't justify what you did." He tapped the papers in front of him. "Here's what's going to happen. You can either cooperate, confess, and take a plea deal, or we can let this go to trial, and you'll spend the rest of your life behind bars." Gloria swallowed hard. She was trapped. For the first time in her life, she had no moves left to make. 2 weeks later, the Richmond courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the entrance, eager to cover the shocking scandal. Gloria Willis, once a respected socialite, now faced charges that could put her away for decades. She sat beside her lawyer, her usual confident posture now replaced with quiet defeat. After long negotiations, she had agreed to a plea deal, 15 years in prison for perjury, fraud, and obstruction of justice. It was a far cry from a life sentence, but it was still a devastating fall from grace. As the judge finalized the plea agreement, Gloria turned her head slightly, locking eyes with Bennett and Carter, who sat in the gallery. Bennett met her gaze without flinching. This was justice, not for Albert, not for Martin, but for the truth. Gloria had built her life on lies, and now finally she was paying the price. Weeks later, Bennett sat at his desk, staring at the final case report. The city had moved on, but he still felt the weight of everything that had happened. Albert Hayes had died seeking revenge. Martin Willis had died for his sins, and Gloria, she would have years to reflect on the choices that had led her here. Carter walked in, dropping a coffee cup in front of him. "Case closed, huh?" Bennett smirked. "For now." She sat across from him, stretching. "So? What's next?" Bennett exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "There's always another case." Carter chuckled. "That's what I was afraid of." As Bennett looked out the window at the city skyline, he knew one thing for sure. Justice wasn't always clean. It wasn't always simple, but it always found a way.